You know, when we think about history, we often imagine it's this single settled story, right? Set in stone. But the history of ancient India, well, that's a whole different ballgame. It's more like a collection of competing narratives, a story that's been written, torn up, and completely rewritten over time. And each version tells you just as much about the person writing it as it does about the past itself. So today we're going to ask, who got to write this history, and why does it still matter so much? Let's dive in.
So let's just get right to the heart of it. Who is it that actually writes history? And does it really, really matter? As we're about to see, the person holding the pen has an incredible amount of power, not just to shape how we see the past, but to define who we are in the present.
Yeah, the single most important thing to get your head around is this. There is no one official history of ancient India. There are many. Think of them as competing stories, each one written with a totally different goal in mind. And by looking at who wrote them, we start to uncover a fascinating story about the storytellers themselves.
Okay, so our first group of storytellers, these are the people who wrote what you could call the very first comprehensive draft of Indian history as we think of it today. European scholars, most of them working for the British Empire.
This period, we're talking the late 18th and through the 19th century, was pretty much dominated by these European scholars, often called the Orientalists. I mean, for the first time ever, they were creating the actual architecture for studying India's past. They founded institutions like the Asiatic Society and the Archaeological Survey of India. They were literally building the entire field from scratch, and some of their discoveries were just monumental.
But this first draft of history, well, it came with a really complicated legacy. On one hand, you have these incredible contributions. I mean, they deciphered ancient scripts that no one could read. They built the first timelines, they translated foundational texts. But on the other hand, all of this work was done through a very specific colonial lens. They tended to see Indian society as static, unchanging, and they often took ancient Brahminical texts as the literal, unquestionable truth for the entire subcontinent.
So naturally, in response to this colonial point of view, a new group of historians emerged. These were Indian scholars who wanted to write back, to reclaim their own past, and forge a history for a brand new independent nation. Now, this new school of history didn't just pop up out of nowhere. Its rise was directly tied to the growing Indian independence movement. Suddenly, history itself became a political tool. It was a way to build national pride and, frankly, to write back against the empire. And wow, the shift in focus was dramatic. Nationalist historians made huge leaps. They brought South India into the main story, and they highlighted ancient republics to push back against that colonial idea that India only ever knew despotic rule. But in their effort to build this counter-narrative, they developed their own biases, right? They often ended up glorifying certain periods as golden ages, and maybe downplaying some of the external influences.
So what you get is this direct clash of narratives. The colonial view says static and despotic. The nationalist response is, no, we had glorious golden ages and ancient democracies. And this wasn't just some dusty academic debate. This was a fight for the very soul of a new nation.
And yet, despite all these sharp disagreements, one idea that the Orientalists introduced turned out to be so powerful, so sticky, that even the nationalists adopted it. And it has had consequences that are still echoing today.
Okay, let's trace this, because it's really important. First, the Orientalists divided India's past along these neat religious lines: a Hindu period, a Muslim period, and then, of course, the British period. The nationalists kept that basic structure, but they flipped the script. They celebrated the so-called Hindu period as a golden age. The really crucial point here is that this way of framing history, born in the colonial era, created divisions that have been picked up and used to fuel communal agendas in modern politics.
This brings us to the next massive shift. After independence, a new school of thought came along and asked a really radical question. What if history isn't actually about kings and empires at all?
So this explosion in historical thinking really kicks off in the 1950s. India is now independent, and a new generation of historians, many of them influenced by Marxist ideas, looked at the old debates and saw this huge, glaring blind spot. They argued that both the colonial and the nationalist stories were obsessed with the top 1%, the rulers, the elites. They started asking a totally different question. What about the history of everybody else? The farmers, the artisans, the people who were completely hidden from these grand narratives?
And their contribution was, frankly, revolutionary. They totally shifted the focus from just political events to the social and economic structures of society. They started uncovering the history of class, labor, and marginalized groups. But, just like the schools before them, they had their own limitations at the start. Early on, they sometimes tried to squeeze Indian history into rigid European models, and their intense focus on class often meant that other huge factors like caste, gender, and culture were kind of pushed to the side.
You could really sum up the mission statement for this new kind of history with this powerful idea. The past of people who have been hidden from history has to be uncovered and written. That right there became the moral drive that powers so much historical work, even to this day.
So all of that brings us right up to the present day. And guess what? The story is far from over. Historians today are grappling with the legacies of all these different schools, all while facing a whole new set of challenges.
One of the biggest challenges now is something historians call the two parallel images problem. It's like this. On one side, you have the picture of the past that you get from ancient texts, from literature, from religious writings. On the other side, you have the picture you get from archaeology, from digging up pots and tools and ruins. And the thing is, very often, these two pictures tell completely different stories. They just don't match up.
Right. So the big question for historians now is, how do you bring those two different images together? How do you create a more complete, a more nuanced, and ultimately a more accurate history?
So what does that path forward look like? Well, it starts with treating archaeology as an equal partner to the texts, not just as something you use for backup, but as a source that tells its own story. It means actively seeking out the histories of forgotten regions and marginalized people. And, maybe most importantly, it means being willing to question the neat and tidy stories that all the previous schools have told us.
So, at the end of all of this, why should any of it matter to us? It matters because the past is never just the past. The stories we choose to tell about it, the heroes we decide to celebrate, the golden ages we might invent, these are the raw materials that are being used right now to build political movements and to shape our identities today.
Which really leaves us with a final thought. If history is truly an unfinished story, and we all have a stake in it, then the real question isn't just who wrote the past, it's who is going to write its next chapter. What are the stories that have been hidden for way too long, and which ones do we most need to tell next?